I've seen Steel 3 times in my life so far. I feel like there's a hotline you should be able to call for doing that to yourself. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before listening to this review. Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan. Welcome back to another unscripted episode of Superhero Rewind. This time, an informal discussion and dissection of Steel from 1997, starring Shaquille O'Neal. Yeah, we are scraping that far to the bottom of the barrel. This is a movie that I have avoided talking about on Rewind for years, partly because it's a really infamous film that always looked awful, and I didn't want to have to sit through it. When I finally, several years ago, did give it a watch, I really didn't want to have to sit down and talk about it, and I finally decided it was time to just bite the bullet and choke down my vegetables and get this thing knocked out. No idea how many of you guys have actually seen this movie. I'm going to be interested to see in the comments if anybody has watched this. I imagine a lot of you guys will be hearing some of the plot points and about scenes and things for the first time because nobody saw this movie. I said at the beginning I've seen this 3 times. I watched it twice in preparation for this. I tend to do that with movies that I don't know very well. The first time I saw it was in preparation for a trivia book that I was writing years ago. I abandoned that project. I published a small version that was kind of a workbook with a bunch of questions from various movies, but I don't think anything from this made that. It might have, I forget. But that was the first time that I saw this movie, and it was a dreadful experience, but I don't remember, or I didn't remember very much about it at all. I'll say what stuck with me was Shaq doing this. I remember that, and I remember his junkyard hideout, and that there's a pile of trash that opens up, and he goes into it like it's his Batcave. That's everything I remember about this movie. So this is not a memorably bad film. It has a lot of things in common with Howard the Duck, I think, mainly in that both of these movies are tonally all over the place, and it can't decide really who it's for, but it's not an interesting failure like that was. There is some merit here and there in Howard the Duck. I can see some sparks of possibilities there. And with this, most of the spark of possibility is in the initial concept in the first place. The things that we took from the comics with John Henry Irons' character and massive missed opportunities, and then also in casting a non-actor, because I think that Shaq just is not a member of the acting profession. He had a couple of big star vehicles. I used the word big loosely because they didn't make any money. One of them was Kazam, which when I first heard about that as a kid, I was like, isn't it Shazam? And then I realized that, oh yes, they're just taking a name that sounds like that and doing a completely other thing with it. He played a genie with this kid in an urban environment, and it was awful. I did see that in the theater. Don't ask me why. And then this, which I didn't watch because the previews looked awful and it didn't look like the property that it was purporting to be, really, was this small budget. I imagine Kazam was made for about the same amount of money. I've not looked into that, but this was made on a shoestring $16 million budget, relative shoestring, and it brought in only 1.7 million. So nobody saw this, and I imagine most of that is because it looked as bad as it is. I want to think that it's not because it's a superhero that nobody's heard of. This is one of those projects where the idea of making it in the first place seems at odds with the way it was put together. So conceptually, the reason you would do this, I would think, is at odds with the actor that we went with and the kind of production this is. So Warner's has a track record with comic and superhero properties of going for some things, not always, obviously, you got your Supermans, your Batmans, but there are quite a few things that Warner's has gone ahead and put into production that are properties that a lot of people aren't familiar with outside of the comic world, that the conventional wisdom would seem to be make it a big property on the merits of the film in the first place and not on initial brand recognition. Create a brand in the first place out of a thing that you're adapting that is relatively unknown. Kind of like the Guardians of the Galaxy would be many, many years later. And that's done with things like Red and with Watchmen to some degree. Certainly in the realm of comics and even literature to some degree, that was a major property, but a lot of people discovered that through the movie in the first place. And even Marvel tried this with Blade. And some of these things have worked out really well and some of them haven't. But this wasn't a Blade situation in that it was taken, relatively seriously, and it wasn't made like a typical comic book movie. That's a movie that really watches like an actual comic book to me, and that was one of the accolades I gave it when I reviewed it years and years ago on Rewind, is it was one of the earliest examples of a movie that really does have a lot of reverence for the visual medium of a comic book and brings that to screen really well before Sin City did it. This is the antithesis of that. This feels like a thing that the studio didn't trust, and I'm not sure how it got greenlit in the first place. It watches like a thing that nobody really believed in, and so they gave it to a guy that has a history of making projects that are based on comics or kind of in that realm, but he doesn't have reverence for that kind of material. He thinks he's above it, and he thinks that the mediums of television and movies should be above this. And so they go to Kenneth Johnson, who made the Incredible Hulk TV show, which is a beloved show, certainly, but he famously got as far away from comics, he felt, as he possibly could. He didn't want to make a superhero thing, and Hulk really isn't a superhero property, and so it fit for that material. He didn't have to really be thinking about comics to make that a good drama and to make it a good, thriller or semi-horror thing. But he also made Bionic Woman, and he made Alien Nation. And Alien Nation, of course, is not a comic property, and Bionic Woman isn't either, but it's superhero-esque. And so he's got a track record of doing things in that vein, but in his mind, trying to make them more legitimate and, less kitschy and silly and over the top and out there. And so he gets Steel, and he's like, well, I'm not really interested in these superhero things, but maybe I can make it not a comic book, not a superhero thing. And so he did an interview back in the day saying that to him, Steel was a modern knight in shining armor, like a medieval knight. And that idea is not without its merit, certainly. Steel is, John Henry Irons is this kind of down-to-earth, in the comics, urban guy who is a weapons manufacturer. Not like Tony Stark, he doesn't have his own company, but he works for a company, he makes weapons, and they fall into the wrong hands, and they're used by this company for nefarious ends. He leaves that company, he gets a blue-collar job doing construction work, and he spends his off hours going up against this company and trying to get his weapons out of their hands and off the streets. And some of those ideas, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, are brought into this movie, but it's not precisely that. It doesn't have as much dramatic potential as that idea. And what happens with John Henry Irons in the comics is he is saved by Superman. He almost dies, Superman saves him, and when Steel asks what he can do in return, Superman says, make something of your life. And so he ends up becoming his own version of Superman eventually after Superman dies. And by the way, he's a character who was, I believe, created for Death of Superman or created just before it, but it was Louis Simonson who wrote a fourth of Death of Superman with 3 other writers, and the artist by the way, was John Bogdanove, who did some other Superman work. And they both, by the way, get credit for the creation of the character in this movie. So it was cool to see Louise Simonson's name on the screen. I've always been a big admirer of hers. And John Bogdanove, fun fact, named one of his kids Kal-El. So anyway, I can kind of see Steel as the modern knight, in that he has a code of ethics, and they come in the comics directly from Superman. He has the same kinds of morals and beliefs, that same set of principles, and he just comes to them in a different way. And he doesn't have, of course, the invulnerability and the superpowers that Superman has, and so his sense of responsibility comes not from what he's able to do on a supernatural level, but because of things that he's done already that have led to some horrible things happening to people. So he's got a little bit of that Spider-Man thing on top of the same kind of natural selflessness, and I think he has that from the beginning that Superman has. And knights, of course, were chivalrous heroes who rode around on horses, saving people and helping damsels in distress. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with the knight idea. But what's weird in the movie is that it follows the really cookie-cutter, done-to-death formula that a lot of 90s superhero movies did, and it's got a cheese factor into the stratosphere, and it's too much a superhero movie, at least of the era, I think. So it's kind of ironic that the director is going out of his way to try to make us not think about superhero stuff, at least when he's talking about this. Oh, I'm above that. You know, what we're making is better than that. There's this bizarre overcompensation that's happening where it actually becomes too much of that. And I don't know if it's because of mandates from on high, where there's particular boxes that you have to check, or if it's because his heart really wasn't in this, so he's following that formula because he knows that's what it's expected, and at the same time he's just kind of in, as Shakespeare said, he's protesting too much. He knows exactly what he made, and he's hoping that it doesn't affect his credibility and his reputation too much. I don't know that it did, because I don't know that anybody remembers who made this movie. I actually keep having to look his name up again. Kenneth Johnson. This movie uses so many of the same cliches we've talked about 1,000 times in Superhero Rewind, and doesn't really turn anything on its head, or it has any way to make them fresh again, or bringing anything new to the table with them. You've got the girlfriend who gets kidnapped at the end. You've got the hero who sort of creates the villain. At one point, the hero kind of gets framed. It's a typical origin in every way. We've been here and done this and seen this with a million of these things before, and so it's disingenuous, I think, to say that this is somehow better than a superhero thing, or that it's, even really outside of that genre, all the way to the point of giving a character that shouldn't have a mask just so that he looks more like a superhero. Steel has a complete suit of armor from head to toe, but he's got to have an open face mask so that he looks more like a Batman, and I suspect so that Shaq gets more face time. And even medieval knights had chainmail over their faces a lot of the time. He's got nothing there. Steel stands there and gets shot with guns constantly and knows he's not going to get hit in the face because he's got plot armor. And there's a lot of that in this movie, where Shaq, and it's really hard to say John Henry Irons, because he's really just Shaq walking around while people are calling him John Henry Irons. Shaq's just constantly not remotely worried that anything bad is going to happen to him, because he knows that his name is in the title and that he's going to be fine. So bullets aren't going to hit him in the face. He can crack a rib at the end and keep going and hardly even mention it again. He gets hurt at one point right before the third act, and his sidekick, Sparks, who is, by the way, just Oracle out of the comics, she goes, "Oh, you've got this rib, you can't go out there." And he's like, "No, I'll be fine." And he is. And he doesn't seem like he's in pain, even in that moment. We're told that he has a cracked rib. I don't believe it, because he seems just fine. And that kind of thing is all over the place in this movie. Why have any armor at all when you've got plot armor? It's a really generic, horribly uncomfortable looking TV kind of suit. And I should say everything about this feels like a TV production. The director comes from that world. This is very phoned in. I can't imagine going to a theater and paying money to see this because it looks like a TV movie. But as bad as the suit is, I think it would be 3 times better if only it had a helmet instead of a mask. And I'm not just saying that because Steele had that in the comics. Nothing about that being a mask makes any sense at all. It's strange that nobody ever comments on it. He comes up with this suit because he's in a steel-making job in the first place, and he came from the military, making weapons for them. You'd think that it would be just a complete suit of armor. I don't know why you wouldn't think to cover your head. The military thing is tacked onto this. That's not an element in the comics initially either. And I suspect it's just because Johnson is used to having military stuff in TV shows he's worked on before. And it doesn't really add anything, and it kind of just overcomplicates what little social commentary might be here, where it just seems like we're taking pot shots at everything that we're used to seeing Hollywood take pot shots at. So instead of this just being an anti-big business, evil corporation thing, it's both evil business, corrupt corporations, and also apathetic and incompetent government. And it's not really saying anything about those things, it's just using those as an excuse to give us a bad guy plot. But it feels like it's trying to dupe us into thinking that maybe it has something profound to say about those things. And once again, the problem isn't that it's changing things from comics if it has as interesting or a better story to tell with those things. It's that it's less complicated initially in the comics, and it also lessens the drama and makes me not as worried about what's going to happen to my protagonist, and it makes it less compelling because just like the plot armor, just like my not being worried that anything bad is going to happen to him, I'm also not concerned that he doesn't have the resources to try to do what he's doing. In the comics, John Henry is immediately a more captivating idea because he lives in a world with Superman, or at least that had Superman in it, trying to do what he's doing with the limitations of a human man. And in this movie, he lives in, I suspect because Johnson, again, wants this to feel more realistic, he lives in a world that doesn't have other superheroes in it. In fact, there are references to other DC properties, Superman some, but particularly Batman, where those kinds of things don't exist in this world, but are fictitious, which is weird in my brain. That kind of breaks my head while I'm watching a thing like this, because I'm watching a movie that is based on a DC comic where every other DC thing is fictitious except for this. But because it's a Warner Brothers property, of course, they're allowed to use those things just as incidental comics and movies and video games and things that people are talking about or playing or watching in the movie. So you don't immediately have that interesting contrast, right, where you've got a guy who wants to live up to Superman and is also inspired by Superman. I think you could have still done that even in a world that didn't have Superman. I think it's weird that there are so many Superman references in this, and that John Henry has a tattoo of Superman that says Man of Steel on it, but there's never any discussion about his background with the character. I don't know why he has that tattoo, by the way. It took me 2 viewings before I realized that he didn't get it during the montage where he's building the steel suit, because there's this long-held insert shot, this close-up on the tattoo on his arm, that it's the classic Superman S, and it says Man of Steel around it. And it because of the way it's shot, if you don't notice it earlier in the movie, I think it's easy to think that that's when he gets it. But if you pay close attention, you actually see it before that. And so he comes up with the steel suit independent of all of that, it seems, because he's not talked about as being a big fan of the character from when he was a kid. He's not inspired by Superman. And it's also, by the way, strange that everybody else comes up with Steel and also Man of Steel independently of him and his having that tattoo. And it's maybe an obvious thing to call a person wearing a big suit of armor, I guess, but you think some other names might get thrown out, and you think that people wouldn't come up with just exactly precisely the thing that the folks in the know that helped create the suit are calling it. So I wish he had that inspiration, and I wish at the very least we had more of a sense of where his sense of self-sacrifice and his moral compass comes from. At the beginning of the movie, we're told that even though he makes weapons for the government, he would like to do everything he can to make sure that the enemy doesn't die, even in times of war. And what makes him leave the military, somewhat similar to the way he leaves the evil corporation in the comics, is the bad guy of the movie, the most generic, forgettable bad guy, not just because he doesn't wear a costume, bad guy probably since the guy from Superman 3, Burke. He is testing weapons, cutting corners, not caring who gets stepped in on or hurt along the way. There doesn't seem to be any real oversight. There's nothing stopping him from basically using human beings as guinea pigs and cannon fodder, and he tests a weapon that gets John Henry's friend and partner Sparks hurt, and she gets paralyzed and she loses her legs. And so John Henry decides, after Burke gets off scot-free for no reason that I understand, at court he says, okay, I guess things aren't as above board as I thought they were. I was naive. I'm seeing things in black and white, but there are these shades of gray where the government, the military, is looking the other way, as long as, and I guess that's the whole reason that Burke gets off, but he does so much stuff right out in the forefront where anybody could see the horrible things he's doing, that I don't see how the government gets away with it without it becoming big, huge news, and that just never comes up. So John Henry says, I guess I can't work for the military anymore because I don't know who the good guys are. And the movie would be more compelling if that was actually part of a speech in the discussion. It isn't, but that seems to be, on paper anyway, essentially his motivations for getting out. I feel like this movie has to be better in script form than it is on the screen, because there's a lot of stuff that, or at least a few things, that seem like okay ideas on paper that Shaq just is not a good enough actor to sell. I'm constantly having to kind of read the line in my mind's eye like it was on paper, because he has these really counterintuitive line readings, and he's just very one note and wooden in his performance, but he also has these really sheepish expressions that makes it difficult to understand what he's communicating, because his lack of confidence as an actor feels as though it's part of the character of John Henry, and it absolutely isn't on paper. This is a guy who's written really confident, really principled, knows just what he wants, is always jumping into the deep end of the pool, taking big risks, and it's played by a guy who makes this face constantly. And that's not the face of that guy, clearly. Now, that's not to say that this is a great story that is just acted and directed and edited poorly. And by the way, there are a lot of unintentionally funny moments in this movie. The bit where Shaq is screaming bloody murder because his partner is getting her legs crushed is hysterical, and I should not be laughing during this scene because it should be really tragic and sad, but it's not, because it's shot in slow motion, and there's this weird kind of quick cut editing that happens around it, and Shaq has this over the top crazy expression where he's the Sparks, and I am laughing hysterically 5 minutes into this movie, and I cannot take it seriously after that. And it never does anything to win me back over because it's so cheese-tastic and sappy, and its lead actor has absolutely no idea what he's doing, and he's completely sleepwalking through this movie. But even though some of what the movie is trying to do with John Henry is not communicated well, that doesn't mean that there aren't still huge problems in the characterization. And the main thing is that John Henry is constantly solving problems with brute force, and the movie wants to impress me with his resourcefulness and with his kind of righteous indignation. But too often, again, he's read the script, he's got plot armor, he's always in the right, even when he kind of isn't, and he just wins because he's the main character, he's the superhero. And so the place where I started to really raise an eyebrow at the characterization is when he decides to break Sparks, or not break her out, but he decides to kind of force Sparks to leave her physical rehabilitation at the VA hospital. And it's supposed to play as a tough love scene where she's feeling sorry for herself because she's in a wheelchair, and it's basically supposed to be like Oracle past killing joke. This villain did this awful thing to her and took away her mobility, and there's a lot of stuff in this movie that should be about somebody who has lost something, has to raise themselves back up, people in precarious situations who are really vulnerable, showing massive weakness, that have to build themselves back up and show strength through sheer willpower. And the movie is just not mature enough to be able to pull those ideas off. And also, with the exception of Sparks, everything is just too easy for our heroes. She has the closest thing to a tragic and endearing character arc for anybody in this movie, but that's not saying a lot. So at least she struggles. At least there are some things that are difficult for her, and by the end of the movie, she's actually accomplished some things of her own accord, arguably. But you have this scene where Shaq goes, you're feeling too sorry for yourself, and my guns are out on the street. We have to find out who's doing this and stop them. It's our responsibility. Again, none of these are lines that are in the movie. It's probably a better movie if he just comes out and says that. But the way it plays instead is he's not giving her the time she needs to heal and to find her confidence again. This just happened, and maybe more time is supposed to have passed than it seems like it has. Maybe it's partly a pacing issue, but the way it watches is she goes into the VA hospital. She's there for no time at all. Shaq shows up and says, and it breaks a window and says, "I'm gonna take you out of here, and you're going to help me do this thing. We're gonna stop these bad people that my guns got in the hands of, and you don't have any say in the matter." And he just strong-arms her against her will. And you don't want to see your hero pick up a woman who can't walk her out of a room under protest while she's screaming, "No, I don't want to do this," and then have the corny, constantly on a loop that never ends, that I'm so sick of, theme of this movie playing as he's walking out, like it's supposed to be endearing and noble. That's a big mistake. And there's a couple of points in the movie where he does things like that. There's another scene, again, the movie's just not mature enough to pull this off, where Sparks falls out of her wheelchair and she has to pull herself back up again. Because the reason we fall is to learn to pick ourselves back up. That's what this scene is about. And she manages it all by herself. Meanwhile, Shaq and Uncle Joe, the guy who runs the junkyard, who is kind of his Alfred in this movie, I suppose, they're off to the side watching this, and it's shot in such a way where we're supposed to buy that she never noticed them over there watching her, but they're just kind of right out in the open, and so when you think about the position of everyone, it's very strange to imagine the scene playing out the way it does. But she gets up on her wheelchair, and then Shaq is like cornily, part of the problem, of course, is his performance or lack thereof. He's a Power Ranger and not one of the better ones. He's nodding his head, good job, you did it all on your own, and it doesn't play the way the scene thinks it's playing, where we're supposed to be, applauding Sparks for doing this difficult thing and starting to find her confidence again, but we're also supposed to be applauding Shaq for letting her do it on his own. And part of the reason it doesn't play is because this all started from him forcing her to do a thing that she didn't want to do and wasn't ready to do again. And so it's very awkward, and those scenes made me really uncomfortable. Shaq in this is unconvincing for lots of different reasons. Part of it is the super corny performance, as I suggested before. Part of it is his size. He's weirdly too big even to play John Henry Irons. Shaq is just a monster of a man. He is extremely tall, extremely large, and anybody in a scene with him, he's towering 1,000 feet above them. And the movie can't decide if it's sort of like Schwarzenegger in certain movies, but very often that's played in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, where we just never bring up his Austrian accent, and he's a lot bigger than some of the characters that he plays are supposed to be, and it's kind of just a joke in the movie where it's played straight, but the movie knows that the audience gets that, and that in certain ways he's weirdly miscast. This just doesn't have that kind of self-awareness, and anything that doesn't work in the movie, it feels the need to double down on and comment on, and that breaks the whole thing. So Shaq is in a number of scenes breaking things on accident with his brute strength, as if he's supposed to be a superhero with powers already, which he's not, and that, of course, is one of the things that makes it difficult to appreciate the blue-collar, pull yourself up by your bootstraps superhero notion. He isn't just a guy. And to be fair, John Henry Irons in the comics isn't just a guy either, in the sense that he is, he has a brilliant mind, and that's the thing I also can't buy with Shaq, because there's nothing behind his eyes in a lot of scenes. He's got this weird puppy dog thing, and it's hard to buy. And he cannot deliver exposition, by the way. And so it's hard to buy that he's a, brilliant weapons builder. But John Henry Irons in the comics is also, a pretty strong, buff dude, but he's not breaking phone booths just by standing at them like Shaq is here. The problem is that Shaq in real life is too close to an actual superhero. He's just got some abilities that hardly anybody else on the planet has. And again, the movie is calling too much attention to that fact. So you would think that this would be a movie about a guy who was born with super strength and has to learn how to deal with that. And it isn't. The movie just wants to have fun with the fact that Shaq is in the role, and it's constantly beating you over the head with jokes about Shaq particularly being bad at free throw shooting and that sort of thing. And it's not a movie about a basketball player, but that stuff's all got to get forced in there. And so it's intrusive and it takes you out. One of the big plot points and setup and payoffs in this movie is about Shaq being bad at shooting free throws. There's basketball iconography all over this movie. We've got NBA Jam in a number of scenes because the front company for the evil weapons manufacturer in this movie, the evil corporation, or I say weapons manufacturer, they're a distributor, they're selling weapons, is an arcade producer, and I imagine that that's partly a desperate attempt to appeal to the youth of the day, and I think it's also there because of Shaq Fu, because there is precedent for Shaq being involved with a video game property, and also because some of the product placement in this movie is video games of other Warner's properties. So in one scene, we see 2 Batman Forever machines. The god-awful Batman Forever beat-em-up that had Mortal Kombat moves in it. That's in this, and right next to NBA Jam machines. But anyway, this is one of the best examples of bad setup and payoff. Just because a story establishes an idea early on in the movie, and then the audience might forget about that, and later in the movie it pays it off, or it calls back to it again, doesn't make that clever or necessarily a good idea. It's not good writing just because there is setup and payoff. There is such a thing as formulaic, cookie cutter, and contrived, crappy setup and payoff, and this is a great example of that. So Shaq, in a couple of different scenes, tries to shoot something into something, either a basketball into a hoop, oh, it bounced out, or he tries to shoot a wadded up piece of paper into a wastebasket, oh, it went to the side, it didn't get in. And then at the end, he's got to get rid of a grenade, and he's got to get a grenade in a hole. And oh no, Shaq's terrible at that. John Henry Irons' biggest weakness is getting small objects into slightly larger objects. And so the big point of tension in this scene is supposed to be, is he going to be able to get this grenade through a hole in the ceiling? And he reels back, and it's in slow motion, I think, and he tries to shoot it. And it goes through, because we knew it was going to go through. There's no suspense there whatsoever. And did he finally get it in because of some kind of opportunity for change that he went through? No, nothing at all. It was just, in that moment, he concentrated a little harder, and he finally got it through that time. Awful, terrible, no good, very bad setup and payoff, and the only reason that it's there is because, it's, again, a really cookie-cutter formula, but B, we've got Shaq here, and we are desperately trying to entertain an audience by not telling a good story, but by just reminding you of the superficial things that you know about this guy. Oddly, this movie in places, I think, borders on blaxploitation. There is some 70s funk music that's in and out of the irritatingly earwormy theme in this movie. Bum, 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 ba-da-don. That will be in my head forevermore, and it makes me want to pick up one of John Henry Irons' pulse weapons and put it to my own temple and see if that does the trick. Bum, ba-da-don, na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. It's also really strange. Well, anyway, so there's a 70s funk music that's in the middle of all that, and it feels misplaced, and it feels like it immediately makes the movie outdated. Not that it's dated because it's using music that's very 1997, but that it's already outdated because it sounds like a thing that should have come out in 1978. And it also, in a lot of ways, even outside of just the music, it feels like a mid-'80s to really early 90s thing. It feels like no other action movies, let alone superhero movies, came out between in 1989 and 1997, it feels like an earlier movie in almost the same way as the unreleased 1994 Fantastic Four movie does. When you go back and watch that, it's very strange to consider that it was not released but shelved the same year as The Mask came out. And I have that with this, where it's like, how does this exist? How did this come out 3 years after The Mask? And how did Batman Forever come out just 2 years before this? It feels really out of date and out of place. Kind of like Green Lantern, where that felt like a movie that, or even Venom, movies that felt like mid-2000s superhero movies that came out way later. I should also mention that it's interesting that this came out in 1997, not just because Spawn came out the same year. A lot of bad superhero movies in 1997. So we have two of these, I want to say low budget. I mean, Spawn got more money, and Spawn had some major visual artists that worked on it, even though they were cutting some corners and making, doing some of the least great work in their career, I would argue. But kind of weird that we have two of these kind of urban superhero movies that are trying to create a space for black superheroes and doing it really poorly and awkwardly and kind of cringe-inducingly. That's, I think, a more entertaining movie and more watchable, but they're both awful, certainly, and they both have maybe some of the same problems in being accessible and following, obvious formula. One thing that Spawn has over this movie is there is some corny dialogue in that, certainly, but it's not overcompensating and relying really hard on modern slang and trying to nail urban street speak. This goes really, really far with that, and it's unintentionally funny, and it's really hard to listen to. But it's also really interesting that this came out in 97, because that's the same year that Superman Lives was in pre-production and then got scrapped. So consider that a thing that was based on a Superman spin-off property that wasn't actually released as a Superman spin-off, was not in a Superman universe, never brings up Superman as a real character, and Superman wasn't even really the inspiration of this guy, actually is more of a Catwoman situation, where it's in a spin-off character that's released independently as the main character in their own universe, but in the same year where a Superman movie was in production. And it's also really interesting that it's, and I don't remember, I don't think the four Supermen from Reign of the Superman were supposed to be in that movie, but it's interesting that Steel was a spin-off specifically of Death of Superman, that he's a character that was created for that event, and the movie that's based on Death of Superman didn't happen and was being worked on the same year as this was released. And I wonder if Superman Lives is the reason that this wasn't a tie-in to Superman. And you might think, well, you'd think that would be the reason that it would be a tie-in, but you wouldn't release this movie before that. So my guess is it was already in production, and then they decided to make Superman Lives, and they went, well, we can't do both of those things together, or we're going to have to wait to release Steel later. We're going to have to change the story and make it connect in some way, so let's just disconnect them entirely. Sort of like the Smallville Aquaman situation, where it's like we're making an Aquaman pilot, but we also later on in Smallville are going to have an Aquaman, but he can't be a spin-off character. Of course, that series, or that pilot never went to series, but he can't be a spin-off character because we got there before that show did. This is kind of maybe that situation in a weird way, and I hadn't thought of that before, but I wonder if this idea hadn't been thought of until after Superman Lives. There's a lot of ifs here, but let's say Superman Lives actually got made, and let's say that Steel was not thought of or was shelved until after that, I wonder how different a movie this would have been. I wonder if it would have been in that same universe, and if it would have been more stylized and more of a confidently comic book thing that wasn't as cheesy, wasn't as TV, had more of a budget, and embraced the initial character as a Superman character. Another thing that's odd about this is that it's trying really hard to be, air quotes, realistic, but it's not just cheesy, but it's also got a lot of over-the-top, goofy, old-school comic visual tropes. And the movie itself, or the movie is not visually stylized enough to get away with it, so it's got a henchman with an eye patch and stuff like that, just completely out of place in a thing that wants you to believe that it's in more or less the real world. Another big reason that it's hard to appreciate John Henry Irons as a poorer, more down-to-earth, grounded street-level hero is because everything is kind of handed to him, and he doesn't have to struggle that much for things. First of all, he starts out as a military guy, and I guess in the comics, John Henry Irons would have been paid pretty well in the corporation he was in. But when he leaves, he just goes and gets a real blue-collar job, and he doesn't have a whole lot in the way of resources. And so he has to really struggle to be able to become his version of Superman. And in this, you've got a guy who's living in a poor neighborhood, I guess, but it never feels like he's going without it all. He gets a more blue-collar job, I suppose, but he still might as well just be Batman, right? He has this hideout in a junkyard, and Uncle Joe, the guy who runs the junkyard, is able to get him virtually anything he needs at all, and so that's just used as a big plot device. Anything that John Henry would need to build his suit or to be able to go out on missions and stuff, this guy can just get for him, and he just has it already. He doesn't have to struggle to find it. There's never any question of... There's never any real hurdles that he has to jump over. And it's very, very cartoony. The most cartoony thing, as I alluded to earlier, is that in the junkyard, there's this big pile of trash that opens up and is the secret entrance into Steel's Batcave. And it isn't just a obvious allusion to the Batcave, just the word Batcave is brought up, because we can't do things like that without being completely on the nose about it. And it's weird because John Henry was there helping Sparks and Uncle Joe build all this stuff. And when he goes on his first mission and he's trying to evade the police a la Batman Begins, which of course is 8 years after this, but in a somewhat similar scene, he gets into the junkyard and he is on comms with Sparks, because again, it's just Oracle. This is basically Birds of Prey if the Birds of Prey consisted of one man named John Henry Irons. And his Oracle says, don't worry, you can trust me. You don't think I'd lead you astray, right? And he drives almost right into the junk pile, but lo and behold, it opens up and he can go into his HQ. And he's surprised by this, and he's like, oh wow, you built this thing. When did she build that? And how? She's working with one old man, and she's in a wheelchair. And also, he's been there the entire time except tonight when he's out on patrol. I don't understand how he didn't already know that that was there. I mentioned earlier that there's an odd degree of Spider-Man in this character with the way the responsibility thing is handled, and in that this is a hero who kind of has to clean up his own mess in a way, but again, not anything like as compelling and endearing as Tony Stark, because he basically goes through Tony Stark's whole first act character arc from Iron Man in like 6 seconds at the beginning of the movie. But another thing that makes it kind of like Spider-Man is he has an Aunt May in this, and it's 5 years before Aunt May in the first Raimi Spider-Man movie. And that's one of the only things that I think is handled okay in this movie. Don't get me wrong, a lot of really cheesy dialogue that I don't buy at all from that actress. I think she's one of the better actors in the movie, but she has this really strange kind of flimsy character thing where she is trying to perfect a French souffle, and I guess her arc is because the message of this movie is spelled out at the end, kind of like at the end of Darkman, but of course that's a much better film than this. At the end of this, we're told that the whole moral of the story is basically you can do anything you put your mind to as long as you have the right help. Okay. And there is a sort of paralleling, if I can even say that, arc, or just, character progression happening with Odessa, with the grandmother, where she keeps trying to get these souffles perfected. Her big dream is to open a restaurant called Black and Bleu. Yeah. At the end, she finally gets her restaurant. It's an outdoor place, and she gets her souffles finally perfected. We don't see that happen. I don't know what changed in the course of the film that finally got her to that place. I didn't see her opportunity for change. I didn't see why she was able to open the restaurant later when she wasn't able to do it earlier in the movie. And I think there's supposed to be some kind of thematic parallel going on with her and John Henry, where the souffles have something to do with taking risks. Like, you hope that a souffle rises, but you can't be sure if it's going to, so you just do your best and you see what happens. And I think that's supposed to be a metaphor for what John Henry is going through, but I never get the feeling that he might be trying something difficult or desperate that may or may not work out, and then we're waiting with bated breath to see if the whole thing pans out. That idea should be all over this. If it's supposed to be a blue-collar, street-level superhero who's just working with what he has, and it's basically just his wits in a few scraps of metal. We're basically told that's what it is, but it very clearly isn't. He's got his hands on anything he could ever need, and he's got massive amounts of plot armor. So that idea doesn't really play, and I'm not 100% sure that that's even why it's there. It might just be that they're looking for some character thing to give her to do, and I'm reaching for thematic parallels in a movie that's not even really trying anything like that. Everybody's got some kind of easy, superficial character quirk in lieu of making them a real complex three-dimensional character. You've got, again, setup and payoff, bad setup and payoff. We're constantly doing this goofy handshake thing with Shaq and Sparks, where every couple of scenes, they've been working together for a long time. They've got this supposed chemistry, and by the end of the movie, as you might expect, they seem to be getting together, and they keep doing this kind of E.T. thing, where they'll put their fingers together in sort of a secret, just them kind of handshake. I say setup and payoff. It never leads to anything. We just keep doing it over and over again, and every time they do it, it's like, you remember that? See, continuity. And it's lame, and I don't know why they do that and how they came up with it and what it means. It's just that's the thing they do. There's an episode of Star Trek Voyager called The Q and the Gray, where you find out that the omnipotent beings, the Q, if they wanted to have their own children, that's the way they have sex, is they just put two fingers together. And if they had ever seen that episode, they would probably stop doing that. Although I think that episode came out maybe the same year or the year after this movie. But I digress. And before we get to my rating, let's find out what some of the patrons said in the Secret Superhero Screen Society with some tweet-linked reviews. We begin with Christian Ogden, with terrible acting, a lame script, and a costume that even Comic-Con cosplayers would be embarrassed to show up wearing. This is one of the worst superhero films ever made. This makes all the early struggles of the DCEU look like Dark Knight or Winter Soldier by comparison. I'll take 5 more Wonder Woman 84 any day if it means DC never makes another Steel. 0 out of 4. Connor Nielsen, WB's cynical attempt to capitalize on the success of urban cinema in the 1990s by copying the Batman formula. Steel is weak with no shortage of laugh-out-loud lameness. At least Judd Nelson's Bruce Willis cosplay is on point. Okay, y'all be cool now. 1.5 out of 4. And then we get Tom's tweet-length review. Well, it's not Halle Berry's Catwoman bad, so that's a plus. But for a superhero movie from the late 90s, it's kind of subpar, 2 out of 4. And then we jump over to some of the responses on Patreon. Just a couple here. The Day Ghost. Oh, this looks sarcastic. Austin says, Steel's a masterpiece of early superhero schlock. What other film has Shaq? Just watch a handicapped woman struggle to get into her wheelchair. I paid $50 for this DVD so I could do a Who Reviews the Reviewers entry on it and never made the review, but it was still worth every penny. 4 out of 4. Chewbacca's Lover, never really saw it, but I know Shaq can't act. Truer words were never spoken. This film is basically a pilot for a TV show that I would never want to have to see more episodes of, so it is a mercy that it wasn't actually that, and that there weren't, and that it didn't lead to an entire season of television. Shaq is not an actor. He's difficult to watch. I'm embarrassed for him throughout the film. The production values are laughable. The suit is just gross and awful and has the worst mask imaginable. If you want to see Bible Man in every way except for Christian Bible thumping and messaging, this is the movie for you. Certainly, it is Blank Man if Blank Man didn't realize it was a comedy. I'm giving Steel a 1 out of 4, which I feel like is maybe a little bit generous, but I didn't dislike it enough to go all the way to a 0.5. Not a lot of merits, not a lot of positive accolades I can give it, but I can at least say that it's not, on the whole, offensively bad. Is this the worst superhero movie ever made? No, I can't call it that. There's certainly things, again, that are a lot more offensive, that are harder to sit through. It's also in that mediocre place where it's, it's worse than mediocre. I hesitate saying that, but just in the sense that it's not memorable. And some things can be memorably bad in such a torturous kind of way, to such a torturous degree, that I would have to rank them lower than this. And then in some ways, this is worse than some other things, because sometimes memorably bad can be entertainingly bad. So it's complicated. Let's go to Letterboxd now and try to decide where we're going to rank this in the Master Superhero Rewind list. If you want to check this list out and see where all my rankings are right now, always subject to change. I reserve the right to move anything around that I want to, but you can see where it's at right now. It's letterboxd.com, and the link is in the description, but you can find me, my username is Captain Logan with an underscore in between the Captain and the Logan. So we have to go down to the ones. I always rank these by the star rating, and so we've got, it looks like our top 1-star review right now is Batman and Robin. Batman and Robin, believe it or not, is at the top of the ones. I have it ranked even higher than Elektra, and you know what? I think I stand by that still. So where is this going to go in the ranking? I did compare this a little bit here and there to Howard the Duck, and I think I see Howard the Duck as a slightly, if not better, at least more entertaining movie than this. I also have Supergirl above Howard the Duck right now, and I meant to mention Supergirl. This had some of those sensibilities to me too, where it watches, like, you know, it's supposed to be a spin-off property. Supergirl actually is a straight-off spin-off of Superman, even though Christopher Reeve's Superman is only in that movie as a cardboard cutout or a picture. Maybe, you know, it was a cardboard cutout. It was a poster, I think. But it had some of the same counterintuitive elements, and it was lame and cheesy in a lot of the same ways. So I'm not sure if I would put this or Supergirl, you know, one above the other. Fantastic is higher than those right now. Brainiac Attacks, which I loathe, is above both of those right now. And I certainly wouldn't put this above X-Men Apocalypse as much as I vehemently dislike that movie. A lot of these in the ones are there for such different reasons. It's difficult to compare them. So this might be somewhat arbitrary. I think this movie is it even better than Ninja Turtles 3? It's hard to say that. And Underdog, like, there's just all the ones I think are kind of a jumbled mess right now, because it's really hard to put one above another. So I am struggling to decide where this should go, because as I'm looking at this list, I'm feeling like some of these choices are kind of out there, or are kind of, you know, random in the first place. But I think I'm gonna go ahead, and I feel like it's got to go right around Howard the Duck. For right now, I feel weird putting Supergirl a couple above this movie, but I think that's what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to put it between Superman 3. Is it going to go between Superman 3 and Howard the Dog? Or is it under Superman 3? You know what? I can't do that. I can't bring myself to do that. I think it's got to go under Superman 3, certainly. Is it even better than Ninja Turtles 3? You know, I don't think it is. It's going to go under Underdog. I'm going to put it in the 136 spot. Going just above... Oh, and then Superman 4 is right under that. I don't know. I feel weird about this whole thing. I'm not totally sure where it really deserves to go. For now, I'm going to put it right under Underdog. That's where it's going to go for now. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody. If you'd like to support what I do here on Geekvolution, and with the Superhero Rewind in particular, you can go to patreon.com/Geekvolution. At just the $2 tier, that's the bottom tier, you can get access to early episodes of Superhero Rewind, of the current off-the-cuff thing that I'm doing. I'm trying to get these out weekly. Eventually, I hope to get back to scripted, but right now, just so that we can keep this train chugging along, we're doing it this way. If you would like to put in a tweet-length review for any movies that are upcoming on Superhero Rewind, you can become a $5 member, and that also gets you access to the private Discord and the Facebook group, the Secret Superhero Screens Society. More activity these days on the Discord, but I'm keeping both of those open, and I am putting up messages about Rewind in the Secret Superhero Screens Society as well. And at the $10 tier, you can become a Patreon producer. And as always, thanks a ton to all of our patrons at every tier, but I want to thank individually our Patreon producers right now, including, and yes, limited to, Zach, Wendell Jones, Nicholas Morgan, Michael Micheletti, Michael Gulick, Kareem Roberts, Joey Whalen, Jacob Schneider, Damon Begay, CM Productions, Caleb, Brandon Menino, The Day Ghost, Stone Gassman, Matthew Bass, Lone Wolf Jedi of Gotham, Carl Maxey, Bag Studios, John McClain, Ian McKee, Elliot Slater, Dylan Musiello, Chewbacca's Lover, and Blake. Thank you guys all so very much. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you again next week. I was Captain Logan. This was Superhero Rewind Unscripted. We'll see you with lots more fun stuff here on Geekvolution in the coming days. Later, folks.
Bye.